whole file. So, you don't need to, you can cut and splice wherever you choose. But yeah, the machine this machine is now recording this locally is basically the difference.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Deacon Charlie, I'm so glad to be here with you today. It's such a pleasure and a joy. I really loved our Sunday Visitor Innovation Talk, Liturgical Orphans, and just to kind of start us off. Where are you, and what is it that you're about right now?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Christina, for inviting me on the show. Really appreciate it. Where I am, well, if your listeners could see, it'd be like this dark cavern somewhere, but I'm actually in my little office studio. We have a podcast studio here. I'm based in Los Angeles, California, technically, because LA is a big sprawling county, about 100 miles from east to west, from the ocean all the way out into, the desert. So, but I'm on the west side of LA, so not too far from the airport here, from LAX. And I've been here since 2000, so 20 plus years at this point.
Wow. Time flies when you're having fun. I know that much.
Well, I was born here, and so always had this sense of California in my blood, but I actually didn't grow up here. So I came back as an adult, as actually almost when I was 28 or 29 when we came back. So most of my life was actually not in California, but now I've been here for a good bit of time.
Well, you have a fascinating story of where it all was that you have grown up. And I think that really has informed your practice of the faith and your perspective of the faith and what it is, especially in your ministry right now. But would you share a little bit of kind of, some of those high moments, those, that you had as you were kind of all over the place?
And I do think, there is the way that I see it, a transformation and growth on a spiritual level usually happens one of two ways: either exploring, or in some cases being confronted or discovering, let's say, perspectives and ideas that you now need to grapple with, right? So the kind of growth that happens when we're introduced to a concept, and it either affirms us in what we believe, or it gives us an opportunity to grapple with that thing so that we can better formulate what we believe. That's one way that we're transformed. The other way, in my experience, is being physically taken to a different environment and experiencing different things, tangibly, right? So think about like an immersion approach to learning a new language, right? You just get dropped and you're going to live here for 6 weeks and you're going to learn Dutch or whatever the language is. And so I look at those things, especially the latter one, as a big reason, I think, that, that God has allowed me to be able to learn and transform through that, because I did grow up in a number of different places. I was born here in LA when we were very young. My father, who ran a division for a financial institution for a big bank, he was transferred to different countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean because of his job. So we obviously went with him. We moved from Los Angeles to Mexico City. Obviously very, very Catholic country and very Catholic city. Our Lady of Guadalupe's Basilica, all these incredible, sights and sounds. I was there for a number of years. Then we went to live in Buenos Aires in Argentina, where our Holy Father is from. Spent some time there. Then went to Venezuela, to Caracas, the capital city there. And then eventually went to live in the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Thomas specifically, named, like all the islands, named after one of the apostles. And then after that, I ended up going to high school and college in Florida. And then after my graduation from college, kind of came all the way full circle back to California. And I've been here for the last 20 plus years.
It sounds like our paths might have crossed at some point. Where in Florida did you go to school?
I went to school in Boca Raton at Florida Atlantic University.
Yes. Yep. So I graduated South Plantation High School.
Wow.
So I lived in South Florida and I had a good journalism teacher who she actually taught at FIU. Florida International for many years, and so it's a very small world. I continue to find that, especially within Catholic circles, and actually, that's something of where I think it's really important to coming back to your talk, is that the experience that you spoke of, and so many, especially young people, are experiencing right now. I think you really encapsulated it, and with your slide, which was every day there are more U.S. Latinos in the church, and every day there are less Catholics among U.S. Latinos.
It's kind of a conundrum right now.
Yeah, that paradox. But the faith is a paradox, is it not?
It is, absolutely. And just going back 2 seconds on your South Plantation thing, I don't think I've ever in my adult life ran into somebody who went to South Plantation. So congratulations for that rare distinction. I was a Western high school Wildcat, so we, obviously played you guys in football and all kinds of other sports. And yeah, so I'm sure we have a lot of folks in our background that we have in common. And it kind of relates in a way to your question, because when I was in South Florida, when I was going to school there, I was one of a few, Latino kids in my high school. And if you go back today, it's 100% Latino, at least or very close, very close, to 100%. And so there's been pretty dramatic changes even in my lifetime that have led to some of these things. The kind of insight that you just talked about is something that when I first heard it really surprised me, because, I didn't get very far in math. I joked that I took, in college, my math elective was physics for poets. So, but when I hear like statistics, right, when I hear statistical data, I'm always going like, wait a minute, how does that make any sense? And so the idea that every day in the church, in the Catholic Church, there are more Latinos, but every day among Latinos, there's less Catholics is basically what it says. I struggle with understanding how that could be true. And the answer is just simply that there's so much growth among the community, period. The tide is rising across the board so much that both of those statistics can be true at the same time. But when you map it out, when you map that trend line out into the future, what it shows you is that the church in the U.S. ultimately becomes smaller and becomes more demographically monolithic, and specifically Latino. So neither of those outcomes, neither smaller nor ethnically or demographically monolithic, should we want. And that's kind of where we're going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I loved how you looked at that paradox, though, and you did something that I do very frequently, which is there's tremendous, risk here, but there's tremendous opportunity.
That's right.
And I think so often we focus upon, on all the negatives and the fact that there are less Catholics among U.S. Latinos. Oh my gosh, we're losing, 6 for, or I forget the statistic, we're losing 6 for every 1 we bring in, that kind of thing, regardless of ethnicity. And it's something of where it's like, no, we have a tremendous opportunity, because where we are right now in this time and place, is unique.
That's right.
We were created for this time and place. So our particular skills and gifts are needed for this time, but we need to know what this time is calling for. And that was why I truly enjoyed what you were talking about, in giving your analogy about the altar server. Could you share that, for our listeners real briefly?
Absolutely. So, I've been, my professional background has been in media here in Los Angeles since I've been here, so 20 plus years. So I've been in and out of Hollywood and big media settings, content companies, studios. And a lot of emphasis on technology in the last 10 years or so, digital media, social media, that kind of world. That's been the backdrop of, kind of where I've been. And within that, I've been particularly focused in the area of how younger demographics that happen to be more diverse in the U.S. are driving a lot of these changes. But I never really paid attention to it within the context of the church until an exchange that I had with a young altar server in the sacristy of our parish. And this was, actually, I can't recall whether or not it was before I was ordained. I was ordained in 2017. So my guess is it was before I was ordained. But anyway, sometime in the last 5 to 6 years, right, this conversation happened. And this particular young man, in our parish, 100% of the altar servers are Latino. That's just the way it is. But in the sacristy, because these are young people, and even outside the sacristy, but in the sacristy, we all speak English because that's the language that they speak with their friends. Even though they may know Spanish, they speak English, and that's their language they go to school in, and they text their friends, and they go on Snapchat and do all these things in English, right? But obviously they understand Spanish in most cases. But anyway, I was having this conversation with this altar server, and I said to him, look, I serve as a bilingual deacon in both of the masses that we have in my parish in terms of language. We have masses in English, we have masses in Spanish, and I serve at both wherever I can. And in this case, these young servers tend to come to the Spanish language mass because that's where their families are. And in fact, in that Spanish liturgy, you'll find, generally speaking, most of the young people in the Spanish liturgy. And so I asked this young altar server, I said, well, why don't you come to the 9:00 mass, which I had just finished serving at? And I said, frankly, we could use some more people, period. And then specifically some more youth in that particular liturgy. And that's when he hit me with the thing that kind of set off a lot of these things in motion, because he told me, he's like, Deacon, I would never go to that mass. And I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean you never go to that mass? He's like, yeah, that mass is so white. It's like, it's not, or it's, I forget exactly how he put it, but he basically said, he wasn't really talking about race. He was just saying, it's not me. It's not my culture. It doesn't reflect me. Mm-hmm. And so at that moment is where, I had a little bit of maybe infused knowledge from the Holy Spirit. And I just saw this young man, he was 15 at the time. I saw him turning 18, 19, 20, whatever it is, going off on his own and just asking myself, well, where is this guy going to worship? Because he barely speaks Spanish. He's here because his family is, and maybe there's some of the trappings of his culture that make him feel comfortable here, but he's not being fed. He's not even understanding the homily. He may not grapple with any of this. So I just said, if he gets to make the decision on his own, where's he more likely to show up? Is he going to come to the Spanish liturgy where he doesn't really get it? It's not in his culture. He doesn't understand, or it is in his culture, but he doesn't understand it. Or will he go to the English one where he can understand every word, but none of it reflects his culture? And the answer is neither, really, sadly, by the data. It kind of shows you that they're just leaving altogether, but it's because they're kind of stuck in this little middle ground between these two realities. And so it was kind of a aha moment for me.
Yeah, I kind of had similar moments in my own ministry in our parish here in our small town. And it's things like, something as simple as, because we've got first generation, kids who they've just learned English and their parents do not. And there's the reality of, there's many times when they're not actually able to communicate fully, let alone really enter into a discussion about the faith. That's right. And it's something of where just that thought, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, such isolation, and it just broke my heart. But can you think of?
I was going to say, Christina, just one thing on that point. Since then, we've learned a lot more. I've studied a lot more about this issue, and we've even commissioned a lot of studies and just learned a lot more. And it's amazing the kind of insights that you find. Your experience you just relayed is one of those, right? This idea of not being able to, even though you're living within the same household, you have some facility in languages, but being sort of unable to fully express yourself, maybe even to your own parents. The other thing that we found out was, the idea that why a lot of people continue to go to the Spanish liturgy, even when they don't speak Spanish or when they speak very little Spanish, is because they don't know the prayers in English. Like it was crazy to me. I thought, well, wait a minute. That's one of the reasons you're not going, and I would talk to these folks. It's like, yeah, when it's time for the Our Father, I just know Padre Nuestro que estás en el cielo. They just don't know it. And I thought to myself, like, well, actually, I get that. Like you want to fully participate, as the Second Vatican Council says, you want to be really involved. And so they go to the Spanish liturgy where they know all the prayers, they know the hymns, but again, homily, preaching, the understanding of the faith, all of those things, a lot less so. And it's a really interesting kind of conundrum.
It is. And we can so identify with that. We've done family catechesis. And so, invariably what we've done is that we've learned, because we'll kind of like go around and each we'll do a decade of the rosary kind of thing, of where so everyone's able to do a Hail Mary. And, initially it was kind of like there was this pause, and it's like, whichever language you're comfortable in. And we just started talking about, it's the language of your heart, whatever the language is in your That's heart beautiful. That you want to express, go for it. And then we saw almost invariably Spanish, even though the kids are sitting there and they're speaking English.
And it's crazy the kind of, the simple hacks that you can come up with, which I applaud you on just that, because a lot of people maybe wouldn't take that step, even though it seems like a pretty simple one. I talked to my buddy Armando Cervantes, who's the director of youth ministry and Hispanic ministry for the Diocese of Orange. I've had him on my show. And the example that always blew me away, and it's so simple. He said, listen, when I do these youth ministry things, we pray or we do the prayers and we do the songs in Spanish, but the entire conference, the entire retreat, the entire workshop, everything's in English, but we do these things. And when I first heard that, I said, man, that is so simple. It's so simple. Like, why can't we do more of these things? But the typical modality is, we've got the book or the missile. I'm sorry, not the missile, the bulletin or whatever the thing is, and we want to just translate it and then kind of have these sort of two churches that exist. And I think we have to look for solutions that really try to integrate people.
Yeah, and I loved what you had said about the fact that translation is the lowest common accommodation, and I was just like, wow, that just hit me, because I'm just going, yeah, no, absolutely spot on. And, we have to share the good news in a culturally relevant
Correct.
way. So it's a matter of, my continuing to immerse myself, and being culturated, so that I'm able to speak and to be able to, but that brings us back to some of the solutions that you had suggested. Which are, shifting your watering holes, voice over language, inside like the outside, and a creative apologetics. And want to kind of go back to, because what we're talking really is kind of voice over language. Correct. Right now. But could you go into that a little bit more in explanation, and then just give a practical example of what that
Absolutely.
might be?
So the idea of voice over language is just an insight. And my hope with all of these is that people hear them and then try to apply them in their own kind of time and place, right? Because every one of these things can take a slightly different shape depending on where you find yourself in the vineyard. But ultimately, for me, the idea of voice over language speaks to the point that you just brought up, right? Which is translating something can be very oftentimes, especially if it's done just for the sake of translating it to sort of solve the dilemma of how do we talk to all these Latinos. It can be the lowest level of accommodation and the lowest effective one at that point, right? So I won't name names, but I've had a conversation with people that are pretty high up in the publishing world, and I've heard stories like, hey, we translated it and it didn't sell, and so Latinos must not like to read. And then you find out, well, what was it? And it was like a theological treatise by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And my first question is, well, what led you to believe that, Guatemalan second-generation Americans are interested in Dietrich Bonhoeffer especially? Maybe they are, but I'm saying, what is the decision-making that goes into some of these calls? And then on top of that, talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater on the basis of one thing. You're like, we're just done with it, right? So I think that the idea of translation and the idea of language is very important, okay? And I always get myself in trouble with this because people think I'm saying Spanish isn't important. Look, I love all languages. And as I mentioned, I grew up all over the place, and I appreciate multiple cultures, and I love it. And if you're a polyglot, like, I'm amazed if you speak a bunch of languages. Amazing. But my point is that capabilities are not preferences. And that's the key point. The fact that I can speak Spanish, or I can speak French, or I can speak Dutch, or whatever the language is, does not mean that that is the language that you should be evangelized to, that you should be accompanied with. You can, make it your own, right? You get the picture. And so the idea of it, especially in an American context as it relates to Hispanics, is it's more important to get the voice right than it is the language. And in my talk, I mentioned some of these voices when I look at it and go like, oh, that's it. The first one, it was actually my kickoff show for my podcast, Living the Call, was Father Agustino Torres. Father Agustino Torres is literally, awesome. He's awesome. He's awesome in every respect. Like, he's, 4-quadrant awesome, right? There's no unawesome part about him. My point about bringing him up is that he is emblematic also of the idea of voice over language, because everything that man says is in a Latino voice. I don't care what language it is, and most of the time it's in English. So, but nevertheless, it's 100% Latino. So that's the idea. And what makes it 100% Latino? The fact that he's immersed in the culture, understands it, has lived it, is in and out of it, right? Even if he's talking English, he has that he's steeped in it. And so because of that, he's a very effective preacher, communicator, and priest of God, ultimately. And that's what we should want, right? For everyone, certainly for all our clergy. And so that's what I mean by voice over language. It's the idea of what takes primacy in this time and place, which is America in the 21st century, which is the context that I'm making these points in. In this time and place, it's about voice over language. That doesn't mean more important than or stop translating. What it means is pay attention to what it is you're trying to achieve and look at that voice and that relatability and that authenticity and lean in more on that rather than just, we translated the bulletin, so we're done.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And it's something that in the continuous, struggle to try and be able to communicate, we forget the fact that, and you brought up, about the fact that voice is more important. And I just had the realization of where it's like, now I understand why when I'm speaking in my, what I consider very broken Spanish, the fact that I'm attempting to speak and to communicate is appreciated, far greater than if I pulled out Google Translate and had the exact
bingo.
words.
That's a great example of what I'm talking about.
And it's something of where, but I have to get past my own pride and uncomfortability, to keep doing that. And but it's something where I think it also attaches to, another solution that you had suggested about the inside being like the outside. It's that authenticity. And it brings back to your altar server, encounter of where he definitely wouldn't see the inside looking like,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And inside like the outside, I mean, it's pretty, straightforward in terms of what it means. The part that maybe bears a double click and kind of some slight clarification is this isn't about a racial thing. Okay. We are Catholics, right? We're children of God. God gave us a variety of different cultures and colors, and we're all equal in dignity, but we have our differences, and that's part of God's plan, right? So this isn't about a color. I think the oftentimes misunderstood concept of diversity and multiculturalism, we see some of the evidence throughout the world today, is one that, in a way, ironically, kind of excludes people. And that's the opposite of what we should want. But having said that, what inside like the outside means is have what you're doing, your apostolate, your ministry, your parish, all of the parts, the organs of the church that are out there in the vineyard, have those things be reflective of the sheep. Right? Pope Francis famously told his bishops, right, smell like the sheep, right? That's what I mean by this. So in other words, if we are, I'm making it up, but we're in a parish wherever. I mean, it could be here in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles where it's 100% Latino, and we have a ministry that is somehow not representative of that community that's there in our backyard, either by way of the participants or by way of the needs that we're trying to solve, then we're really leaving opportunity on the table. We're not really smelling like our sheep. Now, we may be smelling like sheep, but they just might not be in our fold. And so that's the idea that I mean is we got to look around, where we are in this particular time and place, and have our ministries, apostolates, our work, our service to the church be reflective of the sheep that God has decided to put in our fold. And, the macro stat that maybe brings this to life for a lot of people. And every time I mention these statistics, people a lot of times are still very surprised by them. And, when you look at the fact that in the U.S. right now, among all Catholics, around 42% of all Catholics are Hispanic. When you look at all Catholics that are under 18, more than 62 or 3% of them are Latino. When you look at these stats and you're like, well, that is the sheep, then why I want to know a principled reason why our ministries and our work and our service and our outreach should not reflect those cultures and those experiences. Like, it's very hard for me to understand why it wouldn't. So that's why, that's what I mean by inside like the outside. It's just being attentive and attuned to the sheep that we have in the fold that God has given us right now in our time and place.
Yeah. And that really ties into shifting where your watering holes are, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Yeah, that's the other one, which is about, and this comes up quite a bit in maybe for larger, and again, the listeners of this podcast may have a variety of roles that they play in the vineyard, so I'm not really sure. But if you work in, an apostolate, or if maybe you have a ministry of your own or what have you, a lot of the interactions I've had with people oftentimes say, well, I'm looking for these folks to be more inside like the outside. I just can't find them. And inevitably, I'll ask the follow-up question, which is, where are you looking? And usually, and this isn't always, but usually it's Well, the same places I've done for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And the reality of it is, like, just think of it as a university, in a university setting, right? If I'm going to the same school to source and recruit my next talent, intern, employee, whatever it is, from a secular standpoint, if I'm going to that same school or that same neighborhood or that same geography, and then I'm saying, well, I really want to do something different, but I'm still going to that same place. Well, you're probably going to get more of the same, right? So changing your watering hole is just about looking elsewhere. And does it take more effort? Yes. Does it take a little bit more time? Absolutely. You have to want to do this, but it does yield different results. And I think that that's a good thing. And even if in the process you learn some things and you say, hey, this is the reason why this watering hole doesn't work. Well, that's great. But at least you went and you looked and you tried. So that's what I mean by that.
Yeah. And that ties all together with that creative apologetics of where we're looking at, who is it that our sheep are and where are
Correct.
they, understanding, where they are on the journey and meeting them where they are rather than where we think they should
Correct.
be.
Yeah.
But for you, what have you seen or experienced that's kind of like an example of this creative apologetics?
I think you just nailed it right with what you just described, Christina, because the reality of it is you look at those sheep and you go, okay, well, where are they? And then you ask the next question, which is, what do they need? And so if we're looking in particular, let's look at the younger generation, right? So if we look at this younger generation, we find the majority of them, by the stats I just mentioned, come from this particular cultures, but they're generally, more similar than they are different. And so you've got this kind of cultural component. What's bugging them? What's their kind of key issue? And one of the things that I've hit on, and I know it's only one of many, but is this sense of orphancy, this sense of not belonging in either world. I'm 100% Latino. I'm 100% American. I kind of speak both languages. I speak both faith languages, but I don't feel at home in any one particular place. Okay, well, if that's really happening, and I believe that it is, if that's a real need, then what can I do from a creative apologetic standpoint to explain the faith, to educate, to catechize, to accompany in the context of that sense of orphancy? Now, I can't answer that for every apostolate or every, thing in the vineyard, but if you're listening to this and you know the work that you do, you probably can answer that question. Well, if that's true, here's how I could do it in that particular case. And apply that creative apologetic. Creative apologetic is a quote from Evangelii Gaudium from Pope Francis's encyclical. And it basically is saying, hey, look, we have to look for these innovative and inventive ways, given where we are in the world and the time that we're in, to continue to transmit the gospel in a way that is creative and takes a look at the needs that exist, with these folks. And so for me, it's a question of looking at the sheep and saying, here's what they need, and then being creative and innovative around how to serve them so that we can keep more of them here. My bishop is Archbishop Jose Gomez, who in a way is kind of the nation's bishop right now because he's the president of the USCCB. Yeah. But, my bishop looks at the Latino community in particular as the spiritual heirs of San Juan Diego. And I confess, I agree. And I confess, as long as I've been doing this, I never had that thought. And when I heard him say it, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so genius, because it's true, right? Here, San Juan Diego led the conversion of an entire continent. But we think about the Americas and we think Central and South. Well, wait a minute. What about North? And, that's where we're really in need in North America, right? And especially not excluding Mexico, that US and Canada. So why couldn't the Latino community here be that continuation of the work that San Juan Diego began 500, 600 years ago? It's through, this kind of creative apologetic that we could probably get there.
Yeah, because in your talk with your conversation with Jason Shanks, you made mention about the fact that when most people fall away, it's usually because they're not living it out. So they're running into, their premarital intimacy, or they're cohabitating, or, but I mean, that's what they've seen. They've seen, those who are their parents, they never got married for whatever reason. Usually it's a lot of practical stuff, but there's there's just like, hey, this doesn't, I know I shouldn't be, and I'm not. I mean, I'm thinking of a young couple right now that, it was beautiful to watch them this year, because they made the decision, we want to get right. And they but it was painful and it was hard. And, there were times when they were getting discouraged, and it's just like, no, because you kind of went down the, the path that, God didn't design us for, there's a little bit of pain and suffering that, in order to be able to bring it back. But what do you think might be ways that each of us, so as individuals can be helping or living the faith in such a way that, people, might necessarily be able to encounter that mercy more so than judgment, I guess.
Well, look, I think all of this, to my mind, begins at least by some of the principles that we've already discussed, which is, first of all, let's recognize that, we're Catholic. And so, and this is no offense at our Protestant brothers and sisters, but it's a lot easier as maybe an evangelical to say, hey, it's about me and Jesus. And right, we're Catholic. Yes, it's me and Jesus, but it's also the people that we have at our sides. We believe in solidarity. We also believe in subsidiarity. Those are the teachings of the church. So part of it is recognizing who's around us, right? Who can I reach out to my left and my right and touch and impact? Because that's the person or persons that God has us in front of at that particular moment. And it's not by accident. We're there for a purpose. So what can we all do to become first and foremost familiar with who those people are? And the more we do that and we discover them, then we can do a lot of these things that you're describing. And my point was saying, reaching out to the left or right and touching the people, is that when we do, we're going to find not just these people, but increasingly this culture, this community. Mm-hmm. And we have to learn about it and make an effort to connect and to experience so that we can better evangelize and so we can better activate this group. Because to your earlier point, there's a huge opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity that we can help set people ablaze and help them go out and be these, St. Juan Diegos. Right now, they're not. Right now, they're being, Saint Bail the church because they're just leaving, right? and so I think that, the answer to your question, at least from a basic level to me, is to just become more aware of the people individually and then also as a culture and as a community that we have at our left and right in our backyard so that we can better evangelize, better teach, better catechize, better accompany. That's where it begins, with a sense of kind of awareness of who's next to us.
Oh, amen. And when you were speaking, it brought to mind, I had the privilege of being able to be a part of the Fifth Encuentro.
Oh, yeah.
And so I still remember the experience, so I was able, diocesan and then regionally and then nationally. But I just remember there was, what was expressed was there was such a desire and a thirst for holistic formation, and to be accompanied. And, and it was something where what struck me at that time, and it comes back to me now, is that, in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, as people were wrestling with what does this all mean, and lay people came, and said, hey, what are we supposed to do? They were sent to go get degrees, go get a theology degree, go and come and do the things that, we're doing as priests and as deacons and as religious. And what, and what we're seeing now is the fact of, we didn't holistically form people to be able to go out into the world, which is what we're supposed to do as lay people. And what I see right now as the biggest opportunity that we have is that literally this entire, generation is thirsty for holistic formation that's going to empower them to be the Juan Diegos.
Absolutely.
They're saying, please sign me up. And
the data shows that, Christina. The data shows that they are raising their hand, that they are saying, we looked at this in depth about, time, treasure, talent. What is this community most willing to give? And it is that time and talent. They are saying, I want to be involved. I want to be nourished, fed, formed, accompanied in a way that is meaningfully higher than the average Catholic, despite the fact that economically they may not be at a position that other folks are at. So the data backs up exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in this our parish. I was sharing with you before we started recording. We're doing this 3-month process, and that's one of the biggest things that is raising up, which is this thirst and desire for, we want formation, we want to be accompanied, we want to be formed so that we can go and share the good news.
Amen.
So it's something where there is so much hope. In order to get to the promised land, there's a lot of a lot of desert that has to get crossed, and a lot of uncomfortableness.
And some of it is well-meaning desert, let's call it that. I'll give you an example. You mentioned Fifth Encuentro, which I think is awesome. And then the more research I've done about the Encuentro, because I was completely ignorant about the Encuentro until recently, but to think of that this all began back in the 70s, right? We've been doing this for almost 50 years. It's really trying to accompany this Latino community that we're talking about in particular. But one of the downsides of having, these very incredible, I'm not talking about Fifth Encuentro, but just to focus on Hispanic ministry. One of the downsides is if you're not Hispanic, you have this sort of tendency to say, right, oh, well, someone's got this, someone's got this thing. And the reality of it is, again, just based on the raw numbers, like we all have to play a part in this, right? We're irrespective of where we come from. And we have to recognize again that the sheep, are just who the sheep are for our time and place. So I think it's important for us all to consider, this kind of as the broad implications of where we happen to be, rather than a kind of very sort of specific thing too. At the same time, that's the wrestling match, right? We want to specify it, but we don't want to make it too specific, because then people think like, oh, well, someone else has this, right? The office of whatever it is, or the Hispanic apostolate, or it's not EWTN, it's Guadalupe Radio. They've got this. It's like, no, EWTN needs to care about it, as well. I'll give you just one final example on this topic, if it's not too long and boring. But I spoke with I won't name names obviously, but I spoke with a very prominent Catholic sort of philanthropist, person who's done very well and very connected and all that stuff. Very recently, I was meeting this person for the first time. And we chatted about a bunch of things, but one of them was this idea, this kind of Hispanic experience, right, in the U.S. And he said to me, he's like, well, you're a deacon. He goes, how many Hispanic deacons are there in the country? And I happen to know this only because there was a study recently released by CARA that took a look at the demographic makeup of deacons. The answer is roughly like 22% of deacons in the U.S. are Hispanic, right? And there's about 20,000 deacons in the country. The U.S. has the most deacons of any country in the world. So you can do the math, right? There's roughly whatever it is, 4,000 Latino deacons in the U.S. And this person was telling me, you got to connect with all 4,000 of those Latino deacons, and you guys got to get together and figure this out and put whatever. And I said, you know what? That may be true, but I want to talk to the other 16,000 deacons too. Because if we're only talking about this in these kind of little quadrants, it's tough to kind of be the leaven in the dough, right? And that's what we're called to be. It's not just about the leaven, go all hang out, right? All the yeast hang out. No, we're supposed to be leaven in something, right? So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because it was kind of a practical example that I'd recently come in contact with.
No, it's very true. And it goes back to the unintended consequences of what you were talking about in your talk to begin with, which was the fact of that siloed parish and worship experiences, where you got these parallel communities that are going on, and neither the twain shall meet except unless you bump into each other in the parking lot, and it's the same way, and I say, this is kind of where our society is, of where we compartmentalize, of where we say, oh, well, you're not Hispanic or, whatever, therefore you can't speak to this. You can't sit at the table. You can't help us come up with a solution. And there's a difference between, coming up with the solution and saying this is it and putting it upon, a group of people versus being at the table working with them to bring your time and talent and treasure into the battle.
Amen.
And that's something that, I so desperately want people to understand, is that this is church.
Amen.
This is the body of Christ. Amen. And we all have a vested interest. This is not a Latino problem. This is not an Anglo problem. This is not a Black problem. This is, because you got, here in the South, we've got, we have the African American, Black, church experience. Correct. So, you got that going on. And it's like, no. It's a church.
That's exactly right. Amen to you for saying that. I make similar points around not losing your personal agency when it comes to these things, because the current wind of kind of cultural, the cultural push right now is if you're not in that particular group or identity, which is, don't get me started. We could have a whole nother show. If you're not in that group, you have no right to actually come and speak to. It's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite,
Yeah.
right? Now, to your point, are there ways to do that in a way that are going to be more constructive, productive, and efficient? Yeah, of course there are. Of course, you don't come in there and go, I figured this whole thing out. Let me tell you all about it. Well, of course not. You're not going to make very many disciples that way. But if you just leave it to, the blacks will take care of the black issue, the Latinos will solve the Latino issue, the Anglos will solve the Anglo issue, that's just not Catholic. That's not Catholic. And so we have to manage this situation and this opportunity always, first and foremost, as Catholics, as the Church of God, right? And operate that way, to your very good point.
Yeah. There was a great quote. I heard it within the world of Curcio, but it's a quote that's always stuck with me, which is, unity in the essentials, diversity in the non-essentials, charity above all.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's something of where I think it guides us for all of these challenges, but it also, I think what it does is that it gets us focused on the opportunity rather than all the negatives and the hopefulness that there is. So, but I can't believe that our time is already gone. It does. But could you let everybody know where they can find you, especially your two podcasts? Because we didn't have a chance to dive into that. And that is, and the work you're doing there is just awesome.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. So you can find out pretty much everything about what I'm up to just by going to deaconcharlie.com. So deaconcharlie.com will have pretty much links to everything. I host two podcasts. One is what I, kind of call shorthand my Catholic podcast, which is called, they're both Catholic, but my Catholic podcast is Living the Call. And you can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts. So just search for Living the Call, with Deacon Charlie Echeverry. And that's a guest-driven show where I invite, leaders from all over the place. There could be bishops, businessmen, artists, artisans, monks, marketers, you name it. And we talk about, all kinds of fun stuff. So that's that one. The other one is called TDR. That's shorthand for The Diversity Remix. And that show is myself and my business partner. We have conversations about complex issues from, in business, culture, and in politics. And we have conversations that are very nuanced from very different perspectives. So my business partner is a secular agnostic progressive, and I am not. Let's just say that. So we have great conversations about a lot of different things. And I think we need more of that kind of nuanced discussion, just in general. So that's called TDR, the diversity, it stands for the Diversity Remix. You can find that anywhere as well. But deaconcharlie.com is the best place to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And,
thank you.
Part of why, I encourage people to check out, the work that you're doing is because it is, doing exactly what we've been talking about, which is looking at things as an opportunity, doing the work. It is a challenge, but, it's only in doing something hard that we truly can be transformed. So it's something where the more that we are a part of that and allowing ourselves to listen to others who are wrestling with it, the more that it can inform us and help us be better apostles and disciples as well. So, but thank you everybody for joining us today on the Say Yes to Holiness podcast. I hope that this has inspired you, encouraged you, and is helping you be able to continue to do whatever it takes. So together we can tell the master of death, not today. God bless.